back to hour number 2 of the Gary Sutton Show here on WSBA. So glad to be with you on a Thursday morning. Hope you're having a great day. Hey, the sun shines out. It's a good start, right? Lots of things going on today, and not the least of which, the federal government wants to get a little bit more involved in our classrooms. Isn't that good news? Yes. And this is coming from the Justice Department now. And what they want to do is they want to clarify who's being disciplined and how they're being disciplined and make the rules a little fairer. I know when I was a teacher, I couldn't wait for the federal government to get involved in our classrooms a little bit more because they're not enough. I say that tongue firmly implanted in cheek. I did that for 25 years, and I like to be able to teach in the classroom and do so responsibly and be left alone. But Joe Hicks is a former executive director of the Los Angeles Human Rights Commission and the Greater Los Angeles chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he joins us here on the Morning News live from L.A. this morning. Good morning, Joe. How are you?
Good morning, Gary. How are you?
I am doing very well, and it's great to have you here on the show. And I see here where there's new recommendations on classroom discipline that seek to end the apparent disparities and how students of different races are punished for violating school rules. They've been issued by the Obama administration. A school-to-prison pipeline, they call it, stems from overly zealous school discipline policies targeting Black and Hispanic students that bring them out of school and into the court. Thought I'd get your thoughts on this morning. It is certainly a new one coming from the Justice Department, but there's some troubling parts of this as well.
Well, the whole thing is quite troubling. You're a former classroom teacher, and as you pointed out already, you weren't exactly overjoyed whenever you heard that the federal government was getting involved in anything you were doing in a classroom. And I think most good, responsible teachers, and that's the majority of teachers, I assume, aren't necessarily welcoming this because they're fighting this battle in the country's public schools to try to impart some education to kids. Struggling to do that. A lot of kids come to classrooms with bad attitudes, with a dislike for education, coming out of bad homes, coming there, as I said before, with an attitude. And teachers have to find a way to control that environment because it's called, as you know, it's called a learning environment.
Yes.
And if you've got some yahoo who's standing up and cussing out the algebra teacher, that's not a good learning environment. Now the federal government is taking tools out of teachers' hands and local administrators, preventing them from doing exactly that, trying to control the classroom environment so that the kids who do want to learn can learn. I think it's outrageous that, and understanding, so that people don't get confused. This is Barack Obama. Barack Obama has his Attorney General, Eric Holder, intervening in this. So this is a White House that's telling his Attorney General, the White House is telling the Attorney General to get involved in your schools locally.
And also Secretary of Education Artie Duncan as well.
Yeah.
But, there's a couple things that trouble me here, Joe, and I wanted to get your reaction. Number one, I'm tired of being called a racist when I'm not. I'm tired of people coming to me, if I'm a teacher, and saying, you know what, or anybody else in society right now happens to do something to another person without any thoughts of racism involved. I'm tired of the federal government thinking that they know what's best in each individual school district when one size does not fit all. I'm tired of that kind of thinking that seems to really burden us down with yet more regulations and lack of helping. And then I'm also finally tired of the president helping some in this country to the negative effect on most. Your thoughts?
Well, I think most Americans are tired of this mantra of race, and now we've got it. Formerly, we were, in former administrations, we were fending off these claims that we're all a bunch of racists. So if you guys, those of you who are listening, if you're white, there's an assumption that you're some sort of bigot or racist.
Yeah,
that's going in. But formerly, those claims were coming from the NAACP, from all the usual whiners and complainers, Maxine Waters, and on up the chain. We all know who these people are. Now we've got to fend the federal government off, who's now picked up those claims, because many of the people that, including Barack Obama himself, who came in to the White House and to these various arms of government circa 2008, are people who came out of the left, or people who came out of the ranks of ultra-liberals who believe this strongly. Now, I wrote a piece about this last year, in fact. So this isn't brand new, by the way. Maybe, Gary, we can get back to,
Sure.
What are the roots of this? But I wrote a piece last year because the claim is, as you indicated, is that we've got racist teachers who are picking on black kids and suspending and expelling them and disciplining them more often than white or Asian kids. Latino kids fall somewhere in the middle. Now, the piece I wrote made a very simple point. What if black kids are coming to the classroom environment and misbehaving because of other factors having nothing to do with racism, and coming to classroom with those attitudes and misbehaving more often than others, then what are teachers and administrators supposed to do? Look the other way, ignore and excuse the misbehavior simply because of their skin color? I mean, it's an absurd proposition on its face, yet that's what we're faced with. And I think you're right. I think Americans are tired of being told, all the way from classroom teachers to the bus driver, that if you're white in America, you got an attitude against other people, quote, of color. So
in other words, what we're being asked to do in code speak here and all this is you look the other way. I was reading here in one article in the Associated Press, they said the recommendations that were issued encourage schools to ensure that all school personnel are trained in classroom management. I think we do that in college, by the way. Conflict resolution and approaches to de-escalate classroom disruptions. You know, I don't know of any teacher out there right now that doesn't have that somewhere in their repertoire or should have it in their repertoire, and schools reinforce that. Schools are being advised by the government to establish procedures on how to distinguish between disciplinary infractions appropriately handled by school officials compared with major threats to school safety. The government also encourages schools to collect and monitor data that security or police officers take to ensure non-discrimination, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
When I was a teacher, I had a rule. My dad was also a principal, and I hold a principal certificate. I've never used it, but I do have an educational administration in my master's degree. And one of the rules I always went by was, if I can handle my own classroom, I'll do it here. I don't want to send it on to the principal. However, when a situation comes along that maybe requires that, then the principal is going to know that that's pretty important, because I stand for discipline in my classroom. It does not mean hurting kids. It means we're going to operate by a certain level, and we're going to stay disciplined to those parameters. I'll give you an example. We had a kid who moved in one year from Tennessee. He was at our school for about a week. He was pinching girls in the derriere on the way to class and into the auditorium for assemblies, and I caught him one day. And I basically went up and put my hand on his shoulder. I said, you got to come with me to the principal's office. Here's why. And he threw my hand off the shoulder. He said, you take your blanket hand off me. And so he said, or I'll knock you out. And so I said, well, then you better knock me out, because I'm going to put my hand back on your shoulder. And I said, if you don't knock me out, I said, then I'm going to restrain you, which I am by law allowed to do. But I will restrain you off that wall, that wall, that wall, and then I'll drag what's left of you down to the principal's office, and he'll restrain you a little bit more. Well, I took him to the principal's office, and the principal went off on him. Well, the next day, the kid returns to school. Word comes around, he's got a Bowie knife reserved for the principal and myself. So, principal finds out about it. We go down to lunch, excuse all the other kids from the lunchroom. I'm standing there as his witness, and he says, I understand you have something for me. And the kid pulls out a Bowie knife that's about 1.5 feet long. Should we have, been trained a little bit more there in de-escalating the disruption or the conflict resolution or the classroom management?
Well, see, I don't know if the kid that you're describing was black.
He was white, actually. He was white.
Well, if that kid had been black, you would have been branded a racist for intervening and trying to, telling the kid you were going to restrain him and going through all the measures you did to try to direct this kid towards something a bit more proper, shall I say.
The problem I had, Joe, was I didn't see color. I'd never been brought up that way. It doesn't matter to me. It was a person doing something wrong, and I took him up for that reason, which we come back to our original root of the whole problem here.
But here, Gary, here's why this is so insulting. The premise of what Arnie Duncan and Eric Holder are saying with this and I've got a copy of their whole paper on my desk here. It's an inch thick.
Yeah.
And what they're saying is there's something, and the left developed this years ago. They call it the classroom to prison pipeline. Here's the bizarre leftist theory behind that. If you discipline a kid, or you his action is so bad you kick his little butt out of school, he then gets discouraged. He will drop out permanently from school. He'll wind up, robbing a local liquor store. They'll catch him. They'll send him to prison, and his life will be ruined. So we need to avoid doing that. So Eric Holder is telling school districts all across the country, don't get the authority authorities involved, handle it locally. And they put all the pressure back on teachers to do this, including mediation. Now, here's, as you pointed out, see, this is what's so insulting to teachers is every teacher in every local school does that.
Yes.
They want to handle it internally. If a kid is setting his teacher's leg on fire, then you got to get the outside authorities involved. And now here's a scenario that I'd like your listeners to think of. What if you're a teacher in Chicago that has, until quite recently, one of the highest teen murder rates in the country? Black youths in Chicago have been shooting each other down at abysmal rates. You're a classroom teacher. You've got some thug who's a gang member in your class sitting in the back with his hat on, cocked sideways, and the teacher says, Jamal, would you mind taking your hat off? And Jamal tells the teacher, you go screw yourself.
Yeah.
Now, everybody in the class may know that Jamal is part of a gang that just killed a kid 3 days ago, and you're then called upon to deal with this kid, and Arnie Duncan is saying, but you can't get the authorities involved. The kid may be packing for all you know.
Exactly.
I mean, see, this is the kind of thing, and so we've got a White House and a Justice Department and the Education Department so out of touch with what's going on in a lot of urban schools, and they're turning a blind eye to that and saying, well, but, there's a bit of racism because the figures are so out of whack in terms of the numbers of black kids being suspended and or disciplined, but they never ask the right question. Why are so many black kids, if it's not racism, if you don't have a cabal of white administrators and teachers out there just picking on black kids for no reason, then you got to ask the next logical question. Why, then, are so many black kids getting suspended at disproportionate rates above and beyond their white and or Asian peers? But they never ask that question.
It is interesting to me. Education Secretary Arnie Duncan acknowledged the challenges fighting the balance to keep schools safe and orderly. But when it comes to routine discipline, he said, quote, the first instinct should not be to call 911 when there's a problem, unquote. It goes back to something you just said, Joe, and I think it's really important. There is a disconnect in common sense. If they really knew what the education systems were about in this country, they would know that just about every teacher I know, and I know a lot of them, the first thing they want to do is they want to solve the problem there in the classroom.
Exactly.
And they don't want to have to take an inordinate amount of time with that person and take away from all the other people they're supposed to be, educating. That's the reason that they're there. And so when someone decides they are going to disrupt, when someone decides they're going to continually disrupt and make your classroom a place where you cannot spend time with the majority of students who hopefully want to be there to learn, then you must do something about that. One of the things that the president and Arnie Duncan went after, and I'm not sure they're looking at it the same way, as zero tolerance kinds of policies. I kind of am along with them, but I'm not sure I'm in the same spirit they are. I don't like zero tolerance laws, only from the standpoint of I think they also are zero common sense laws.
Exactly.
They then force the teacher who has common sense to now go along with some inane law that says, well, if Johnny points his finger at you like a gun, you better get him down there right away and get him into a court hearing, because otherwise that poor kid may likely bring in a gun the next day. I want to come back with you, Joe, and talk about that, the zero tolerance aspect of this whole thing.
Exactly.
Joe Hicks with us here this morning. He's a former executive director of the Los Angeles Human Rights Commission and the Greater Los Angeles chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And you can join him as well here on the Morning News on WSBA. I was reading a Yiddish proverb this morning in my reading, and one of the things that it said, a half-truth is a whole lie. If half the truth, if the whole truth, for example, is that someone is racist in the classroom, get rid of them. Okay, if that's proven somehow, get rid of them. But don't send the group memo out to everybody for an individual problem that you have to deal with. Joe Hicks is a former executive director of the Los Angeles Human Rights Commission and the Greater Los Angeles chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he's with us on the Morning News. I kind of like that Yiddish proverb, Joe, that
good.
Half-truth is a whole lie, and that's just the way it works. So,
exactly.
There are instances, I'm sure, where there are people in this country who, are racist. We know that. And yet at the same time, one of the things I always hated when I was in education, you knew one person was screwing up. You heard about it, and then everybody get the group memo because the administration or whoever lacked the courage to go deal with that problem.
Well, that's true. But see, what I wanted to also, just so your listeners kind of know some of the history of all this, see, this got on my radar screen early last year when Barack Obama gave a speech on this to a bunch of professional educators and union and education union leaders. I think it was Boston, and he raised this whole issue about disparate impact of disciplinary treatment of youngsters, and his argument was that it was disproportionately affecting black kids, and we had to do something about that, review our disciplinary policies. He turfs that to Arnie Duncan and to Eric Holder. Now, the Justice Department, of course, has got the big saber involved here, and they're rattling it a lot. They're scaring the hell out of local school districts. They've actually sued a number of school districts, including a school district in Maryland, over its disciplinary policies. So this is serious business, and school districts are taking notice. For instance, the LA Unified School District right here in LA, where I'm sitting, took note of this. They voluntarily abandoned their entire disciplinary policies. Of course, they did it willingly because they're mainly a bunch of liberals, and they want to go along with it anyway. So they're now insisting that when teachers are dealing with a kid who's quote-unquote willfully disobedient, I love that term.
Willfully disobedient.
They're insisting that they go to mediation with the kid. So the kid screams at the teacher or threatens the teacher or whatever it is. They've got to then go and sit in some room, sit across the table from this kid, and the teacher's got to say, well, you know, little Johnny, I probably could have done some things differently. What do you think you could have? I mean, this touchy-feely kind of nonsense. Now, earlier, Gary, you did mention where I think you and I are in sync with some of what's being said here, and that's about zero tolerance.
Right, and I wanted you to pick up on that.
Because you and I know, that sort of it takes a big, broad turn around common sense approach to kids in school. And you pointed out, kids have been expelled from school for coming to school with an NRA T-shirt,
right?
Or a kid is playing on the school ground, and he uses his finger and points it at the kid, and they're playing cops and robbers, and boom, the kid gets snatched, and next thing you know, he's out of school. That makes no sense. You want teachers and administrators to be able to assess every supposed infraction and deal with it from a common sense approach. So fine, let's abandon these silly, zero tolerance policies and let local school teachers and local school districts deal with these issues of discipline at a local level. We don't need the federal government to impose themselves and have Big Brother in each classroom insisting that they toe some sort of line. So, it is a matter of common sense, and I think most teachers, I'm sure when you're in the classroom, you're a good teacher and you have the ability to assess when something came up. Now, what's the best way for me to diffuse this, handle it? If it escalates, then I've got to go somewhere else with this.
I'm thinking back, I've been a basketball coach for, this year will be 38 years, in high school and also in AAU. And one of the things that came up one time, I had black kids and kids of mixed races and kids who were white on my team, and they were all together. They were all my sons. I looked at them all that way, and I looked at them all in an equitable way in terms of how they would have to be treated. And I was thinking about, if I take Arnie Duncan and, the Justice Department's thoughts here, Eric Holder, I disciplined a guy on a basketball court one day because he wasn't hustling, he wasn't doing the things I asked him to do. So I said, you have to do 30 laps or something like that. And he said, that's it. I'm walking off the court. And he went off the court. He was one of my best kids I ever had, a leading scorer in the league, the whole thing, but he walked off the court. So I, walked away, let my assistant coach take over, kind of walked in the locker room. He's sitting there taking his time to take his stuff off because he really doesn't want to leave. And I'm kind of, standing there saying, well, I said, what's the problem? He said, I can't take this anymore. And he said, I'm quitting. I said, well, okay, you turn your stuff in. And he went, what? I said, turn your stuff in. I said, but know this. I said, if you walk away, you will never, ever play in this uniform again. And he said, what do I get if I go back out? I said, double the punishment I gave you before. I said, because you have now questioned my authority in front of the other people out there, and you must now pay that price.
Exactly.
I said, there's a consequence to what you do. So I'm thinking today, I went back, I talked to him, I solved the problem. He came back out, never missed a day of practice in all 4 years, and never heard another word from him after that.
But you said something very important. I hope your listeners picked up on. See, one of the things that this federal involvement in disciplinary policies from a racial perspective does, it sends a message that there really are no consequences of bad behavior.
Exactly.
Kids have to understand if you do X, then Y is going to happen, which is a reason for them to avoid doing that bad thing or misbehaving. If a kid gets the message, I can get away with anything I want almost in a classroom, then they will. It's sort of part of the taking the racial angle out of this. It's part of the code of youth to test the boundaries. What can I get away with today? And kids do it with their parents. They will do it with teachers. They will do it with any authority figures to figure. And it's part of, and part of it is good. It's healthy. It's growing up and trying to flex your muscles and figure out what you can do, what you can't
exactly.
do. And part of that process, them learning that if you do the wrong thing, then there are consequences of that behavior. What this federal involvement says is to teachers, we're going to take that tool away from you. Don't involve the authorities because it's going to ruin these kids' lives, they claim. I claim not. I claim that kids will in most instances, except for that hardcore gang member, is going to learn from that involvement, even if it is involvement temporarily with the juvenile authorities. He's going to say, that wasn't pleasant.
Yeah.
Hopefully, mom and dad, if there is a mom or a dad at home, is going to say, I hope you learn from that. Don't you ever do that again. And kids learn from that. I think there's all sorts of, we could talk about this for hours.
And unfortunately, I'm right at the end of my time here, which I apologize for. But I tell you what, Joe, you've laid so much common sense on the table this morning. It's good to consider. You and I are going to talk again very soon. It's been a joy having you on the show today.
Let's do it, Gary.
We look forward to it, okay?
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Joe. Joe Hicks, former executive director of the Los Angeles Human Rights Commission, with us here on the Morning News. When we come back, we're going to take your calls on this subject. And basically, it's this. Should we discipline different kids in the classroom differently? Do you have examples of how your kid has been disciplined? Throw them out here. And what about zero-tolerance policies? Are they good for our classroom? You tell me, Gary Sutton, 1-800-357-0910, back after this on WSBA.